The desert world was not kind to wanderers, and he had walked it for weeks with little more than rusted gear and a will to keep moving. His ship sat gutted and lifeless behind him, and each sunrise felt like a battle against heat, hunger, and silence. Still, he pressed forward, a solitary figure scouring cliffs and canyons for salvage that might trade for a ticket off this forsaken rock. His days blurred into one another until a sound shattered the monotony, a cry sharp and alien, echoing across the stone. It was not wind, not an animal. It was fear. He froze, instincts honed by too many close calls. Following the sound, he spotted them. Two small figures scrambling down the canyon floor, their steps frantic, their shapes unmistakably not human. Behind them came armored shadows, mercenaries with rifles raised, precision in every stride. The human could have turned away. None of this was his business. He had seen enough to know that standing between children and soldiers was often a death sentence. Yet something deep inside refused to let him move on. Survival had been his creed, but survival without purpose was little more than waiting to die. He dropped his pack and worked with the terrain, his hands moving faster than his doubts. The canyon offered jagged ridges, loose rocks, and crumbling ledges, tools enough for someone desperate. A salvage charge, meant to break ore veins, became his first strike. He lured them into narrow ground and lit the canyon with fire and dust. Rockfall crushed one. Confusion scattered the rest. The children shrieked, but he pressed them onward, dragging them through smoke and echoing chaos. He fought not with strength but with cunning, turning every scrap of knowledge into a weapon. The chase was brutal. His rifle spat bursts until the barrel seared his palms. His legs carried them up slopes until every breath burned. His mind measured every second against the mercenaries' discipline. He bled from a shoulder where a shot had grazed him, teeth clenched against the sting, refusing to slow. The girls clung to him, wide-eyed, trusting without words. Each glance at them hardened his resolve. He was alone, outgunned, already half dead, but he would not let them fall. Hours later, in a hollow beneath the cliffs, he collapsed with them at his side. Their alien features glowed faintly in the dark, eyes reflecting the dim light of his lamp. He offered them the last of his water, forcing his cracked lips to stay shut as they drank. Hunger gnawed at him, wounds throbbed, and his body begged for rest, but he kept watch, clutching his weapon with trembling hands. The mercenaries would regroup. They would come again. He knew this fight was far from over. Still, he had chosen his path. He had promised, without saying it aloud, that no harm would touch them while he still drew breath. On that barren world, beneath skies that seemed to stretch forever, a lone human drew a fragile line against death and swore to hold it. The girls stirred awake in the dim shelter, their voices soft and halting in a tongue he only partly understood. Through gestures and fragments of galactic common, they made him grasp what he had stumbled into. They were not lost wanderers, but daughters of high blood, taken for ransom or worse. Their pursuers had not given up, and every moment alive was borrowed time. He listened in silence, binding his wound with strips torn from his jacket, then coaxed them to eat from his dwindling rations. They stared at him with wide, curious eyes, astonished that a stranger would share what little he had. The desert pressed harder with each passing hour. Drones skimmed the horizon, their hums echoing through stone valleys, searching. He led the girls along shadowed paths, pushing his body past exhaustion. When the machines drew close, he threw rocks to mislead their sensors, hid them in cracks between boulders, and muffled their fear with a steady hand on their shoulders. His weapons were nearly spent, his strength fading, but his determination sharpened. Where his enemies relied on numbers and technology, he clung to ingenuity, to patience, to a human refusal to surrender. As the days stretched on, the daughters began to speak more freely, their voices blending broken words with hesitant laughter. They were baffled by his resolve, whispering that no one from their world would risk so much for those not of their blood. To them, compassion was weakness, kindness a flaw. Yet here was this human, frail and bleeding, refusing to abandon them. They began to follow not because he dragged them forward, but because trust had taken root. He answered their questions with quiet honesty, speaking of his home, a small blue world far away, where children played, without fear of mercenaries. The weight of what he had chosen began to press on him. He knew nothing of the empire these children belonged to, but their mention of their mother stirred unease. A figure powerful enough to command soldiers like those he fought could hardly see him as more than a nuisance. Would she consider him a hero or an intruder meddling where he did not belong? He pushed the thought aside and focused on each step, each breath, each decision that kept them alive. Night fell again, painting the sky in ribbons of fire as distant storms raged across the horizon. The girls clung to him, exhausted but safe. Then the ground quaked with a sound unlike any storm. The air itself seemed to tremble. He lifted his gaze and saw a vast silhouette descending from the heavens, a ship so massive it blotted out the stars. Its hull gleamed with power, its presence undeniable. His pulse hammered as realization struck. Whoever their mother was, she had arrived, and her shadow swallowed the world. The air vibrated with a roar of engines as the colossal warship settled above the canyon, its sheer size dwarfing the land below. Dust billowed, soldiers in ornate armor poured out in disciplined lines, and weapons tracked every twitch of his body. He stood still, bloodied and worn, clutching his rifle though he knew it would do nothing against such force. The daughters broke free from his side, running toward the towering figure that emerged from the ranks. She was a vision of authority and power, her presence like a storm-given form, eyes hard as carved stone and armor etched with the scars of countless battles. He expected his end then, expecting judgment swift and merciless. His body tensed as her gaze fell on him, sharp and appraising, her stride deliberate as she closed the distance. She was everything the galaxy whispered about, a queen, a conqueror, the living embodiment of fear. He braced for the inevitable, heart steady not with hope but with resignation. Yet before her soldiers, before her court, the daughters clutched her hands and cried out the truth of his deeds, recounting with trembling voices how the human had fought, bled, and refused to abandon them. The queen listened, her face unreadable. Then, to his shock, she stepped closer and lowered herself onto one knee. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of engines and the gasp of her warriors. A queen, feared across stars, bowed before a ragged wanderer. In her culture, debts were sacred, and saving royal blood bound her honor tighter than any chain. She declared him not intruder, not enemy, but protector. And by her law, protectors were raised above all. He stood frozen as she spoke the words that changed everything. She offered not riches, not a ship to leave this cursed world, but command of her armies, authority over legions that bent only to the strongest. The offer was no gift. It was binding law, unbreakable and final. The weight of it crushed him more than any threat could. In a single breath, he was no longer a lone scavenger fighting for scraps. He had been drawn into the heart of a civilization, marked by a bond he had never sought. The soldiers lowered their weapons, their eyes now burning with something other than contempt. Respect, disbelief, even fear. The daughters clung to his side, smiling with relief, while he stood amidst them, stunned and silent. What he had done from instinct and compassion had shifted the balance of power in ways he could not yet fathom. The queen had given him a place in her world, and in that moment, the stars themselves seemed to tilt. He tried to refuse, voice hoarse as he told her he was no commander, no strategist, only a drifter who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. But the queen silenced him with a single gesture, her tone cold yet absolute. The law of her people could not be bent. By saving her daughters, he had claimed a bond stronger than blood, and her throne demanded it be honored. Soldiers who moments ago would have gladly ended him now waited for his command, eyes sharp with expectation. The weight of their stares pressed heavier than any battlefield wound. Dragged into her war council, he was forced to confront a reality he never sought. Maps of star systems sprawled before him, campaigns plotted with brutal efficiency, and generals argued for conquest through sacrifice. Their logic was simple. Strength was proven by how much could be crushed underfoot. Yet when he spoke, weary but unshaken, he offered another path. Use the terrain, protect the civilians, strike with precision rather than drowning the stars in blood. They scoffed at first, mocking the fragile human. The queen, however, silenced them again, reminding them whose word now carried the weight of debt and law. His first trial came swift, a border conflict brewing on a fractured world. Alien generals urged overwhelming firepower, but he chose restraint. He ordered evacuations before bombardment, devised ambushes with minimal loss, and relied on deception rather than brute force. When the dust cleared, the Empire had won with fewer casualties than ever recorded in such a battle. Whispers spread quickly, first as disbelief, then as legend. The human general who fought not to conquer, but to protect. Soldiers who once doubted him now marched with pride under his banner, their loyalty tempered not by fear, but by respect. The daughters became his constant shadow, bridging the gulf between him and their people. They repeated his lessons to their kin, that mercy was not weakness, that compassion could forge loyalty stronger than chains. The queen herself, though bound by iron tradition, began to see her empire through his eyes. In his methods, she glimpsed strength that did not need to roar. Rivals across the galaxy took notice, some fearful, others curious. Humanity, once a forgotten footnote on the edge of known space, now stood represented by one man whose choices had already begun reshaping empires. He often stared out into the stars, reflecting on the strange path that had brought him there. He had not sought glory, power, or command. He had only chosen to protect two frightened children when no one else would. Yet that choice had altered the fate of civilizations. The Queen's armies marched at his word, and entire worlds now looked to a human for guidance. Alone, battered, and unknown, he had carved a place for his species among the stars, not through conquest, but through the simple, stubborn strength of compassion. And in that truth, the galaxy would never be the same again.